Hello, Chris O'Doherty.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Great to see you. And your exhibition is called Prince Charming, and that's Prince as in Prints, Prince Charming, at Project Gallery 90 in Sydney. And all of these, as of course the exhibition title suggests, are prints, so etchings or lithographs, and most of them have come from a very long relationship that you've had, a couple of decades now, with Secada Press.
Yeah, but Michael Kemp runs it. I started with him out at Meadowbank Tech about 20 years ago, and Michael's a fabulous printmaker. His own prints are amazing, but he's been running the print department at COFA for quite some years now, and so I've been working with him along with a group of artists who come in as guest artists and with his students. So it's kind of a collaboration with Michael in a sense, and all us artists get to escape the loneliness and possible monotony of our own studios and actually interact with other people, with Michael and with the students, and also I get to see other artists and how they sort of approach the discipline of printmaking. So it's been a great experience.
And so how do you, as an artist who, as you say, like many artists, spends a lot of very solo hours creatively working in a studio, how do you find it then when you move into a collaborative relationship with someone like Michael Kemp?
Oh, well, it's refreshing really, because it gets you out of the house, and it also you're engaging with other people, because obviously, but when you're in your home studio for hours and hours every day, it's a relatively solitary existence. I mean, I don't mind that. I'm kind of like that anyway, but it is really nice to have a break from it occasionally.
I suppose I was also getting at, how do you find the actual physical collaboration where somebody is bringing a new or different set of skills to the process of creating your final artwork? You've brought those creative skills and in many ways the artwork ideas and much of the hands-on work, but it's also a team effort to produce that final image that we're seeing in this exhibition, for example, on the gallery walls.
Yes, it is, and in a sense, it's like Michael's very perceptive, because every artist he works with, he has a good look at what they do and how they go about their art practice, and then he suggests ways of adapting what you do as in terms of paintings or drawings, or if you're a sculptor or whatever, in terms of adapting it to an etching, and then obviously, I mean, I carve the plate, but Michael will often sort of do the actual aquatints and judge the extent of how much tone you're putting in or subtracting or whatever, and then the students do the actual hard work of making the actual prints.
When you say you, for example, carve the plates, how close a link in this process is there to your drawing process? Because drawing seems so central to so much of the work you produce.
Yeah, well, for me, it's good, because in a sense, I do a lot. I probably do more drawing than painting, and I'm particularly fond of using charcoal, and so there are a lot of similarities in it to the texture of the line and the tone that you'll get with an etching that you also get with the charcoal drawing. So there are a lot of for me pleasing similarities in terms of the of both disciplines.
Now, as people will see when they look at the catalogue, and I should remind viewers that the idea of this and other interviews in the exhibition series is for viewers to have a look at the works on the website of the gallery at the same time, ideally, as listening to our conversation. But as they look at the catalogue of the works and start examining those works, they will see, of course, that all of them are signed by Reg Mombassa, who of course is you. But I wondered, what is the relationship between Chris O'Doherty and Reg Mombassa? How do you feel about him?
Well, I mean, it sort of doesn't worry me at all. I mean, some people find it a little bit puzzling. Some people find it difficult calling me Chris if they know me as Reg, and other people find it difficult calling me Reg, particularly if they have known me for some time before I had the ridiculous pseudonym which came about in the early days of the Mentals, when we would just, think of ridiculous names for each other and try and make them stick for a while. And I happened to have that one.
That one's stuck for a very long time, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'd known I was going to be stuck with it for 30 or 40 years, I might have given it a little more thought. I mean, fortunately, I didn't get stuck with my previous name, which was Dorky Bladder, which would have been a more tricky one to to live with. And it's a shame in a way. My father was a bit disappointed that I became publicly known with a ridiculous false name rather than my family name, but hopefully he wasn't too disappointed.
Well, it has gone into the Australian language, absolutely immovably now. But speaking of Australia and shifting slightly to the landscape of this country, there are quite a number of images in this exhibition which are very much rural landscapes. Your exploration and appreciation of parts outside the city. A couple of them I wanted to start with. The one is called Waimea Highway near Gore, and another Great South Road near Timaru. They're both of those images are stretches of road with green hills and hedges and so on. When you see a landscape, what is it that makes you think, I would like to capture and share this?
Well, both of those ones you mentioned are both in New Zealand. I mean,
okay, sorry, right.
That's okay. I mean, I was born and went to school in New Zealand, but so I love the landscapes even in Australia that kind of remind me of New Zealand, and I love things like neatly trimmed hedges and the rolling green hills of New Zealand, and the similar landscapes in Australia, like for instance, the South Coast with its rolling green hills, or the North Coast with its rainforest areas. So I'm attracted to things like that, but I've always loved the landscape, and I taught myself to paint by copying mainly Impressionist paintings when I was at high school, out of art books, and I've just loved the landscape since then. And I do a lot of, I mean, those etchings that you mentioned were based on Swift charcoal drawings that I did while travelling in cars on musical tours in New Zealand, and I do the same thing in Australia. So I do a lot of really Swift charcoal drawings as I travel, when I'm not driving, of course. Excuse me. So that's so a lot of my works are based on works that I do in that respect.
Yes, and I should definitely have picked the New Zealand reference from the titles, if nothing else. So apologies for that. But I was just interested in that, that response to the landscape, what it is that grabs you, because there is a certain, very very much a human element in the landscape that you seem to be attracted to. There's another work with two dams in it, two dams, two poles. So there's that kind of human intervention in the landscape somewhere. The very neatly trimmed hedges that you just mentioned, the curving road ahead. Is the human part pretty interesting to you?
Yes, it is actually. I mean, obviously, a lot of artists love the really wild, sort of outback, desert stuff in Australia, or the wild mountainous areas of New Zealand. And I mean, I like that stuff too. I've been on a few art trips where we go to the wilderness and paint and draw those things. But I have always been attracted to the park-like, I mean, my earliest paintings were actually suburban landscapes. You can sort of see a couple of them behind here, but so I do like that, the almost park-like sort of neatly trimmed hedges and shrubs and bushes, as well as the wilder aspects of the landscape.
Actually, just as you're pointing to works behind you, just diverging for a second, the one with the house and the small boy in front of it, which we can see over your shoulder, am I right in remembering that that's a very early self-portrait?
Yeah, I think I did that when I was 23, and that's me it was taken from a little tiny box brownie photograph that my parents had, and that the house in the background was built by my father. So yeah, so there's a sort of a nostalgic reference to family history in those paintings. I did quite a few paintings because we shifted around a bit around South Auckland and North Auckland, and Dad built all the houses we lived in. He was a carpenter builder, and so it's kind of, in a sense, it's a mark of respect for him too, because they were his artworks in a sense, because he had a scholarship to go to art school when he was 16 in Ireland, but his father died suddenly and he had to get a job, and so he was apprenticed out as a carpenter. So Dad never got to express his his artistic sort of interest in a professional way, whereas I did, and I always felt a little bit sort of, I don't know, sad or guilty about that. But so painting his houses was a way of respecting him in a sense.
And also recognising that in those houses was something very characteristic of a creative mind. They had an aesthetic. Many of the houses that you have painted have perhaps reflect and respect the aesthetic which your father built.
Oh yes, most certainly. I mean, some artists do suburban works, and they're being a little bit, maybe a little critical or sceptical about it, but for me it was a very positive reflection upon that type of lifestyle. And let's face it, most people in this part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, grew up in the suburbs. I mean, a few of us would have grown up on rural properties, but most of us did grow up in suburbs on a quarter-acre block.
We were just talking then about a very positive reaction to an aesthetic, to a look. But some of your works, getting back to this exhibition, some of the allegorical landscapes, like Bone, Poles and Wires and Robot Priest, they seem a very satirical or critical landscape where are you sharing a certain horror of what we may have invented and what we may have inflicted on the landscape?
Oh yes, no, I have an enormous horror and fear of humans and human history. But humans, when I say humans, I mean human, the men, the patriarchy that have governed the human race for the last 6,000 years or so of our recorded history, and the incredible cruelty and violence and damage that they have wrought upon ourselves and upon the earth and upon the animals. So there's so the more sort of, I guess, allegorical narratives, or whatever you want to call them, or the more graphic works, are definitely an opportunity for me to rant and rave and express my fears and anxieties about all of those matters.
And yet you often seem to be able to express that horror, that darkness in those graphics with a very considerable sense of humour as well. How do you think you find that balance between humour and horror?
Yes, no, you're entirely correct. I mean, there's definitely an enormous amount of absurdity, and I mean, in a sense, I mean that is a way of dealing with the horrors of the world, is to laugh at it or make some sort of absurd reference, or make some sort of weird circular visual pun or literary pun. Obviously, the title of this the print exhibition is a fairly ridiculous pun itself.
It's that sort of visual satire that perhaps in some ways has made you, without doubt, one of the best known Australian visual artists of the century, let's face it, because there would,
Thank you.
well, there would be very few individuals in Australia who wouldn't at some time, particularly anybody under, I don't know, probably not even under 60, anyone under 70 at some time or another in their life would have worn a Mambo garment, almost certainly with one of your designs on it. It's iconically, to use an overused word, iconically Australian. Do you have a sense of how it feels to be so much a part of the aesthetic visual history of a country?
Yeah, I mean, I enormously am grateful for the fact that I got the opportunity to get my work in front of a lot of people, and that was through obviously doing the stuff for Mambo and, you know, doing their T-shirts and posters and yardage patterns, and again, that gave me the opportunity to do my sort of more ranting and raving and ridiculous allegorical narratives and graphic works, and get them in front of that public, and I very much, I feel extremely grateful for the fact that that happened, and because a lot of artists, you know, if you're exhibiting only in galleries, I mean, that's fantastic too. I love the quiet, reverential sort of almost religious aspect of an art gallery, and showing works in art galleries. But I also like the idea of getting my work in front of a more general public and in front of people who may not actually go to art galleries. So that was a great opportunity for me to you know, get my work in front of a larger audience.
You have managed to navigate that that very careful balance between what's regarded as fine art and that which is tremendously publicly popular. Do you have a sense of any distinction between the two, or for you, is it just all one process?
Well, yeah, for me, it is pretty much all one process. I mean, you know, I think it's definitely, some people in the fine art world would make a big distinction between so-called fine art and graphic art or popular art or popular culture art or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, as a child, you know, growing up in a working class household, I didn't have much knowledge of fine art and paintings. We didn't have lots of prints on the walls or stuff like that, or art books in the house. So I was, you know, my artistic appreciation really only just extended to comics and, you know, book illustrations and advertisements. And as a child, I thought that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. But when I got to high school and discovered all the fantastic, you know, art of the so-called fine art, I mean, I became extremely interested in that and wanted to do that. So I do. I mean, funnily enough, you know, someone like Robert Crumb, the American underground comic artist. Robert Hughes actually once said that he thought he was the best post-war American artist in terms of the way he was reflecting American society and culture back at itself in an extremely often critical and harsh but very funny way.
There are some, going back to the exhibition specifically, though, there are some, I was about to say surprising works, but they're works which, that when people see them, they may not associate them with your more familiarly known aesthetic. And I'm thinking particularly of a work like Stars on the Murray, which is, you know, a beautiful, thoughtful, well, literally series of reflections on the surface of the river. There are a lot of really intimate studies of parts of eucalyptus trees. You know, they're a different part of you, or they seem to be a different part of you to some of those allegorical works.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in works like that, for me, it's a bit refreshing because they're a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more gestural. You know, in a lot of the more finished landscapes or graphic works are tighter and more sort of anal retentive in a sense. So doing something a looser and more and swifter is sort of gratifying to me, because I mean a lot of the charcoal landscape drawings I do, particularly the ones in cars, have that aspect too. I mean, because they're very swift. It's you don't think about it too much, and you don't sort of bog down in sort of detail or neatness, which I have a tendency to do sometimes.
I'd like to finish up with one particularly colourful work, which I think is not one of the Secada Press works, the Fire and Water. Was that one that was produced elsewhere? I think that was a lithograph rather than an etching. Can
Yes,
you give us a little bit of a sense of how that came about?
Yeah, that one, that's the only lithograph in the show, actually. There was that was done at the Victorian Print Workshop a few years ago. My brother Peter O'Doherty and I had we had a residency there for a week or so, where we actually stayed in the workshop, and we each made a series of etchings and lithographs. And while there, we did a couple of gigs as well, of course, because the opportunity was there. So yeah, so all the works in this show are etchings from Secada Press, except for that one lithograph, and I quite enjoyed doing. I've done a few lithographs at COFA with some of with people like Rue Hanks, isn't it, who is also an amazing printmaker, and some of Michael's other assistants and colleagues. So I have enjoyed doing the odd lithograph as well.
And that particular work does seem to include both those elements of exuberance and very joyous colour, but also a fair bit of horror along with the imagery.
Yes, that's. I mean, it's an Australian Jesus figure. Obviously, I mean, there's obviously some references to our common natural disasters in Australia, which are fire and excessive water, or lack of water in some cases. So I was referring to that, and the Jesus figures, his eyes have popped out and they're floating on the water because he's horrified at the at seeing what the humans have done to the world.
Well, who knows? There may be an updated version one of these days with a reference to the coronavirus, as well as the fire and floods, and now germs too.
Yeah, no, I have. I've actually done a couple of very horrifyingly absurd self-portrait recently with a bandaged, bleeding mouth and blackened trunks growing out of my head. So it's a fairly disturbingly ridiculous series of self-portraits.
Well, on that suitably horrifying note, thank you very much indeed, Chris. Thank you for sharing your exhibition with us, and great to talk.
Thanks very much for having me on your show, Richard. Thank you.